Why? Why is the U.S. so biased in this particular situation? Because, like you've mentioned, it's not only threatening sanctions on Ethiopia, which is a huge deal and could really tank the economy, as we've seen happen in other countries, but they also appear to be planning to suspend Ethiopia from what's called the U.S. African Growth and Opportunity Act, which, according to reports, would have a devastating consequences on that country's economy. And already there's been horrible consequences on Ethiopia's economy. Inflation's up. And people really are suffering from, not being able to access basic goods in the areas where there are fighting, as we discussed. But, I understand the U.S. had a very deep relationship with the TPLF for their time in power, but I just can't understand the U.S.'s calculations in this instance. Like, it doesn't make any sense why they would alienate a longtime ally like Ethiopia with so many punitive measures. And it's not like Abiy Ahmed was running around talking about down with the Yankees. Like, he was still being an ally of America, maybe not as much as the TPLF might have been, but it wasn't like there was really anything you can point to specifically that was going on to make the U.S. so anti-Ethiopia now. And, I've heard some complaints from some people, some sources I've spoken to about the U.S. ambassador to Ethiopia, this woman, Gita Pasi. She's very uncooperative regionally with other U.S. officials and other countries in the region. And she's very one-sided in a way that's been surprising to some people who work in the region. And then there's the head of Africa at the National Security Council, this guy, David Diaz, who doesn't even seem to be an Africa expert at all. And then they deployed this guy, Jeffrey Feltman, who has zero experience in Africa to help mediate the conflict. So on top of, trying to understand, I don't understand what the U.S.'s calculation is here. And I'm not quite sure they even really have one. And, it could be a number of things. Like, is it the geostrategic importance of Ethiopia? Is it the China-U.S. Cold War, right? Because Ethiopia does have a big relationship with the U.S., but it also has a growing relationship with China. And, Ethiopian Twitter certainly believes that there's a regime change scheme afoot here coming from the U.S. government that's very planned and very in cooperation with the TPLF. And, I don't blame them. So is that the case? Or is this maybe also a case of a Democratic administration with no real coherent policy that's reacting to media reports and human rights reports, which seem to kind of really be driving it more than even the administration, maybe, rather than these people sort of crafting the policy and the media and the human rights organizations following? Because we do know that sometimes policy, is driven by different factors. It can be Congress, it can be the White House, it can be economic interests. It can also be the media and human rights organizations. Yeah. So I guess all that said, I'm curious, what do you think as our friend AOC would say, the why is? Mm-hmm. What's the why?
Well, really, what's yeah, I hear you. Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. I have to say, I was deeply surprised that the U.S. turned so quickly on the government of Ethiopia. As you said, I mean, Ethiopia had done nothing to provoke the United States. The only thing they had done is say that they want to have better relationship with the United States. Obviously, there's a large diaspora from all of the Horn of Africa countries here in the United States who, play a very important role in culturally enriching a lot of major parts of this country, and many of whom have become citizens and are voters. It was not something that I certainly expected. And if you look at some of the initial statements by the U.S. government, they seem to be a little bit surprised that the TPLF would go this far, and then it quickly changed. So, provisionally, I would lay out two factors that I think speak very heavily to what you have laid out. One is the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam issue and the relationship to the politics of the Middle East there. I think the other one is the broader issue of the geostrategic reality of the Horn of Africa and the issue of national independence, sovereignty, and its relationship to imperialism. So, starting on the first issue, the first kind of hint that something was changing perhaps was in 2018, where The Trump administration said, because there's been a long-running issue over this large dam that Ethiopia is putting on the Nile River that will be one of the largest producers of clean energy anywhere on Earth, and will produce a huge amount of clean energy for not just Ethiopia, but many surrounding countries from South Sudan to potentially Kenya, Somalia, and so on and so forth. So it's a big development project, big for Ethiopia, in many ways big for the planet. And there's a lot of controversy over this with Sudan and Egypt, which are downstream from Ethiopia in the Nile River. There is an agreement, or at least a framework of an agreement, for where a certain amount of water will be released every season or whatever into the rest of the river for the rest of these countries to be able to do their agriculture. This is, this happens all the time with dams that are going between two different countries, and also even between and within states here in the United States. It's a huge issue in California every year, right? Which is where water is going to go vis-a-vis population centers and agriculture. So this, not surprisingly, is an issue. Now, Egypt and Sudan said that, well, there's going to be a huge drought if this dam is filled. There is actually no evidence really that that is the case. There certainly are some issues in terms of water flow, but there are issues with water flow in the Nile that are related to climate change, like many other rivers all around the world. And there is no concrete evidence that, except perhaps maybe during a period of the second and final filling of the dam, there could be a little disruption, although that has not been proven. But I'm just putting that out there for transparency's sake, but that almost everything that's actually been determined about this so far, and including reports that came from this past year, where the dam is already being filled up, is that the impact is actually nil. And in fact, the greater challenge to Egypt vis-a-vis the Nile River is the issues surrounding climate change that are affecting the whole Earth, the whole planet, and certainly are affecting the Horn of Africa. So it's a canard issue that there is going to be a loss of water or economic dynamism for Egypt or for Sudan, but nevertheless, especially the government of Egypt has just picked up that cudgel. Despite the sort of scientific information, they have decided to go a different way, to claim that Ethiopia is doing something terrible. They've had war games with Sudan. I don't know 100% what is motivating the government of Egypt in taking this hardline position. I don't want to get into that. But what's important about this is in 2018, because many of the various frameworks and formats to address this, the African Union, IGAD, which is a group of countries in the region, those had all failed. And so the US, Trump personally said, I am willing to do it. Like, I will intervene, I will mediate. But then rather than mediate, he actually just took 100% the side of Egypt. And that surprised many people, because it was like, well, wait a second, like, first and foremost, you're a mediator, not a determinant, but also like, at the very least, there are two sides of this issue. And from at least what I've seen, it certainly seems that Egypt is not being truthful about what the impact of this is. So you'd think that it would be more even-handed or whatever. So that was already a raised eyebrow, like, well, that is something. So I think that issue is important, though, because when you think of the context of the pivot to Asia, one of the main U.S. pieces policy-wise since the Obama administration has been how to reduce the footprint militarily in terms of the Middle East, and how to introduce sort of a balance of power politic so that they can introduce more of their military power into encircling China. And it's obviously something that has been behind a lot of the moves. Obama, I believe, actually openly said this once or twice. But saying all that, Egypt is obviously one of the key pillars of the security architecture of imperialism in the Middle East. Obviously, it maintains really the key role of the blockade of Gaza, because Israel can do whatever they want to do. Egypt can do whatever they want to do. They choose to connive with imperialism, with Zionism, to keep the people of Gaza starving. But funny how that de facto blockade doesn't get denounced in the same way what's allegedly happening in Ethiopia is. But setting that aside, obviously Egypt plays a major issue and a major role there in that broader security architecture. And also, Sudan has recently been brought into this security architecture. Sudan, of course, is a long time under the previous government, which, again, many negative things you could say about it. But one of the things you can say about the previous government is that they were staunch supporters of the Palestinian national liberation struggle. And so when there was a mass protest in Sudan that brought that government down, very important protest involving many progressive forces, including a lead role by the Communist Party, the Sudanese Communist Party, and others. Then a new government comes in. We can talk more about that later. But long story short, they're still under all these sanctions from the era of Omar al-Bashir. And so the U.S. basically goes to them and says, hey, we'll drop all the sanctions, which of course is important because you're a new government, you're coming in, you want to develop your country. But they were like, got to drop Palestinians, got to pick up Israel. So the new Sudanese government, they did exactly that. They became enemies of the Palestinians and they became friends of the state of Israel, and they're now in it. So you put that context in, of the U.S. wanting to have a sort of balance of power politic that more or less mimics what we've seen in terms of the imperialist status quo in the Middle East, but with a smaller footprint. And it makes sense to me that you would certainly then be thinking, well, I'm not too happy about anybody, even my friends, who maybe seem to be upsetting the apple cart there. And I mean, the possibility, I truly hope this does not happen, of potential war between Egypt and Ethiopia, Egypt and Sudan and Ethiopia, and the destabilization of the whole region, and what all that could mean, obviously would throw a monkey wrench into this broader U.S. security architecture. So I think that's one factor of why the U.S. has been so hostile to Abiy Ahmed's government and so willing to push the TPLF back into a position of power, of prominence, of influence, because I think they believe that the TPLF, which has a long history of collaboration with U.S. imperialism, to the extent of destabilizing countries like Somalia and other terrible things that they have done, that they would be more willing ultimately to find an accommodation that Egypt and Sudan think is right vis-a-vis the issue of the dam, perhaps even let the issue of the dam go. I mean, who exactly knows? I mean, it was a project they started, but who really knows? I think that's one broader piece of it. And I think the connected piece of that, which is the willingness of the TPLF to match its aspirations to the aspirations of U.S. imperialism, is the issue of independence. So, I brought up the issue of Iran earlier, and I've also brought up the issue of the Middle East. So I think, again, when we look at the sort of character of the government of Iran, it's not, Cuba. It's not some socialist revolutionary government seeking to bring right and equity to the whole world in the face of brutal humiliation and inequality that capitalism and imperialism has brought to the world. It's not that. But it is a country that says, like, we want to basically do our own thing. We want to work with Europe. We want to work with America. We want to work with China. We want to have our style of Islamic government. We want to relate to countries around us in the way that we want to relate to them and not in the way that the United States says. And we don't want to be subordinate to the interest of Israel and the United States. We don't want to have to, hold back our economy. I mean, you think about Iran and the issue of missiles. One of the reasons that people really confuse this issue is ballistic missile technology is also satellite technology. So in the United States is saying, well, you have to not just limit your infrastructure and your electrical power, which of course there's nuclear power that they use to power things in Iran, but that you also have to limit your scientific technological ability to succeed and prosper in the 21st century. You can see how that's that people don't like that and end up in an oppositional stance. But that is the precondition that U.S. imperialism puts on every single region of the world, is that you can only exist as long as you're willing to fill a role inside of the system that leaves you subordinate to us. Now, there are different roles, and there are different roles that are certainly better than others. Some countries are much more deeply victimized than others. Like, South Korea is playing a role, but there's a much higher living standard in South Korea than there is in, say, Sudan or Chad or, any of these other African allies of the United States. But you have to be able to play that role. But like I said, the point I made about Iran is an important point because it speaks to the fact that in the 21st century, the fraying around the edges of the imperialist consensus has meant more countries and more regions, whatever their sort of, socio-political content, are developing stronger, more powerful economies and also have a lot of economic potential, and they don't want to fit into the role that the U.S. has ascribed for them. The same thing could be said of Turkey. I mean, obviously, Erdogan is one of the most execrable leaders of any country on earth and, is doing terrible things to the masses of people there in Turkey, but somehow he's in this major issue with the U.S. and Europe, and it's basically because he doesn't want to conform 100% to what they want him to conform to, and, he wants to have his own power politics in the broader region that gives the elites of Turkey, or at least the elites who are behind the AKP party, a bigger role in the broader world economy. People want a bigger slice of the pie, and they don't want U.S. imperialism to tell them what to do in every possible way. And we could get into this, but I do think that has something to do with the nature of the African Union negotiations in the Ethiopia issue. But to circle back around, the Horn of Africa is obviously one of the most geostrategic regions on the planet Earth. I've said this before. I think I said this on our last interview about this. Just remember what happened when that ship blocked the Suez Canal.
Yeah.
And it was like a massive crisis for the whole world.
Yeah.
This is basically the area that the Horn is in, is this crossroads of the world. And for thousands of years, it's been one of the main crossroads. I mean, the Horn of Africa, and also, some of what is now Yemen, which was controlled by the Kingdom of Axum at the time, was in fact the key link between the trade between the Roman Empire and India. And in and of itself, was a very rich society because it was really representing these crossroads of the world. So since thousands, 1,000 years ago, this has been one of the key crossroads of world commerce. And now as everything is shifting economically a little bit back more towards the Eurasian landmass, then I think you can certainly see that the issue of the Horn of Africa, whether it be international commerce, whether it be the politics of the Middle East, in which it is obviously in some ways kind of a part of that sort of broader Southwest Asia piece when you look at it on the map, and so on and so forth, then you can see that an independent state that emerges there. I mean, there's actually nothing in the cards that says it would be negative or hostile towards the United States. In fact, I think if you look at the sort of record of the various governments in the region, I don't think they would be looking to do anything other than cooperate, for a mutual benefit. But it creates the same problem that Iran creates, because Iran wants to cooperate with the United States for a mutual benefit. They're desperate to cooperate with the United States on the economic issues and other things like that. That's why they were willing to give up so much in the Iran deal, which was a truly concessionary deal. But that doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you want to work with us. It doesn't matter if you want to be friends. If you aren't willing to accept the ascribed role as a friend that you must have, I can't deal with you. And the fact that you may try to independently do something or exert your own power over mine so that I cannot determine the course of events in critical geostrategic regions. And when you go back to 1992 and the Wolfowitz Doctrine, which has governed U.S. foreign policy after the fall of the Soviet Union, that is in fact the goal, is to maintain strategic control and hegemony over every important strategic region of the earth. So anyone who might try to do something different becomes a challenge, which brings me to one major issue, and that is the Ethiopia-Eritrea peace deal. I believe that that plays a major issue in why the United States has been so willing to take the TPLF side, essentially, and really try to pressure the Ethiopian government on that issue. There's a long history of war. And this was a massively historic peace deal that was made between these two nations, and really, I think, raised the hopes of people all across the Horn of Africa about the possibility for what it could mean to have more unification in the broader region, economically, culturally, and so on and so forth. But of course, Eritrea and the United States, deeply at odds in many ways. Eritrea certainly has been one of the main forces in the broader Horn of Africa region that already, even as a small nation, even as a developing nation, has been resistant to unfettered rule and determination of the United States of the politics of the Horn of Africa, has been a critic on that front. That has also been a staunch critic on the international front of the, U.S.-led international order, if you will, the so-called rules-based international order. They've pointed out consistently how that is sort of enforced poverty for many of the nations of the world, especially nations of Africa. And so the possibility that there could be more unity in the Horn, which there's many things we could say about U.S. policy for the past 40 or so years in the Horn of Africa, but the one thing we can say for absolute certain is that the U.S. has tended to always favor fragmentation and division over unity.
To weaken, yeah.
For an obvious reason, when you speak to the issue of independence and the ability to leverage your own power in geostrategic regions. And I think the fact that the new Ethiopian government was willing to sideline, the Friends of Imperialism, was willing to sign a peace deal with Eritrea, which the TPLF never would have done. They waged 2 wars against them, and also then start to work with the president of Somalia to create a new dispensation in the Horn of Africa that isn't hostile to the West. I think it's important for people to know that, but is in favor of a stronger sense of self-determination, a stronger sense of national independence, a stronger sense of the ability to operate economically and socially the way you want to. That poses a serious danger to, I think, the U.S. imperialism attempt to control the region.
Can I ask you something with regard to that? I have an American friend who made a stupid liberal argument to me, and I'd love for you to respond to this, because with respect to the Ethiopia-Eritrea peace deal that Abiy Ahmed won a Nobel Peace Prize for making, I was kind of like talking to this friend about reasons why the U.S. is doing this, like why. Basically the question I asked you. And I was like, well, maybe it's this peace deal. And the response was like, that's really stupid. The peace deal won the Nobel Peace Prize. You wouldn't win a Nobel Peace Prize for something the West doesn't want or is opposed to, which I thought was a really stupid argument. But can you just very quickly tell me why that's a stupid argument? Because I know this friend will be watching.
No, of course. Well, I mean, Martin Luther King won the Nobel Peace Prize. I don't think he was the most beloved by U.S. capitalists. They actually assassinated him 4 years later. I don't really know who controls the Nobel Prize. I think it certainly serves an ideological purpose. But I think, we can just see much more clearly. I mean, there's been criticism of the peace deal in the West from the beginning on a range of different levels. But two, I mean, I think it's just clear when you look at the context and the politics of the region that the United States blames Eritrea for everything that happens in the Horn of Africa. You know, Al-Shabaab, that's Eritrea. East Sudan, that's Eritrea. Anything negative in Ethiopia, that's Eritrea. Everything is some hidden hand of Eritrea manipulating everything for
like
negative
Cuba,
purposes.
Right?
Yeah, it has that kind of reality. And there's a lot of complex thought behind that. But when you look at that level of demonization that's been put on the country, the demonization that's put on the country by many other nations, the derogatory statements that have been made about Eritrea over the years by many different individuals and organizations, it's clear that there is not an era of good feeling between the U.S. and Eritrea, that even though they have relations, you know, they are cool in many ways, and that the main reason for that is the U.S. has not been able to find a way to integrate Eritrea into the overall imperialist system. They dance to the beat of their own drummer, and they refuse to be integrated only on the terms of the United States into the broader world economy. And I think when you look at the fact that the TPLF was so heavily in favor of destroying Eritrea, isolating them on an international basis, then there's this peace deal, and the U.S. is then backing the TPLF, who under sort of really their own reality is saying we want to return to either leadership of the country or veto-style power over the direction of the country, that they wouldn't then be thinking, well, one of the subsets of this is going to be a rollback of unity between Eritrea and Ethiopia. Because without a doubt, if the TPLF was to gain a significant role in the government, that would be something that they would absolutely demand. So why would you be pushing a force that's going to do that? Even if it wasn't your number one goal, if you weren't basically okay with that. And I think that they're more than basically okay with that. I personally believe, and to address your friend specifically, that is exactly what they want. And it's exactly the thing they fear, because it is the axis of the idea of independence inside of the Horn. It's the axis of what could possibly be a more independent dispensation, to have all these countries working more closely together and in a way that would open up more economic growth. But certainly, again, just given the history of Eritrea, that would open up a political perspective as well in the context of greater unity on the Horn that starts to favor, a perspective that's more leaned towards not only the development of that region, but the development of the African continent, and in a way that is not along the lines that imperialism in the United States or Europe would want to dictate.